While Star Wars is obviously science fiction, since its beginning, it's always relied on other genres for motifs, themes, and storytelling. Sure, there are spaceships, aliens, and FTL travel, but there are so many elements you likely wouldn't find in a Verne novel or an episode of Star Trek. With the wizards and magic of fantasy, the sword fighting of Chanbara, and the bounty hunters and outlaws of westerns, there's a reason Star Wars is called an epic space opera. In many ways, it feels like a modern mythology set in the sci-fi genre, built upon the film genres George Lucas grew up watching. In many ways, this is a benefit. Star Wars is incredibly approachable. You don't need to know anything about space or even sci-fi to watch along. Odds are, you get how an order of monks works, or how to follow a car chase, even if you normally wouldn't be interested in sci-fi, which is the good thing. The same stories that guardians read to their children before bed are reflected in the stock characters and basic plots of the Star Wars films. In many other ways, this is a curse. Not all of the trappings of these genres are positive or even neutral. Fantasy has damsels in distress, so of course Star Wars does too. Swashbuckling films show amputees as duplicitous and untrustworthy, so losing body parts in Star Wars makes you more machine than man. Samurai movies have the conflict of ninjo and giri, so Star Wars needs to water that down to say the righteous don't have emotions. Now, a lot of these are present but thankfully subverted, in some ways more obviously than others. Though Leia may start out as a damsel in distress, she certainly doesn't remain one, even for the rest of the movie. While Obi-Wan may see Anakin's prosthetics as dehumanizing, Luke actually sees them as a sign of their shared experience and humanity. And while Yoda's personal code may work just fine for him, it's pretty obviously not universal, as it doesn't assuage Anakin's fears. But there are other elements that are not so easily dismantled. One of the most notorious is the trope of the native allegory. Being largely inspired by westerns means that Star Wars has its sheriffs, its bounty hunters, its outlaws, and its cattle barons. We see saloons and horses and homesteads and trains just moved into space. And of course, we see the people who originally lived on the land, the natives. In the case of Tatooine, this is the Tuskens, or the Sand People. Given the inspiration from westerns, the films being made primarily by and originally for US Americans, and several motifs played out through their appearances, the Tuskens are, in many ways, an allegory for, or a representative of, Native Americans. Being from a sprawling desert moving with their herd, certain aesthetic elements in George Lucas himself's words link them to Bedouin people, and the elements of Tatooine carried over from being filled in Tunisia have led many to see them as representative of the Amazian. I'd also be remiss to not mention the now much more positive Pacifica coding brought to the Tuskens in the Book of Boba Fett by way of Tamura Morrison, who is Maori, incorporating elements of his culture as well as other Pacific Island cultures into his portrayal of Boba, Django, and now the Tuskens as well. I've seen people say their dance, their weapons, and their rituals are reminiscent of Fijian and Maori customs, and I can tell that a lot of people really appreciate this much more positive change. I've also seen people say the clothing of this new tribe reminds them of Dene clothing, and more people than before have felt represented in Star Wars, and in a positive way as well. Then it all came apart. Regardless of whom you see them as representing, they are undoubtedly indigenous to Tatooine. As usual, I wouldn't make this comparison myself if I didn't see individuals from these groups make them. And if you don't immediately see the problem, thank you for clicking on the video despite never having seen a Star Wars movie before. Since the beginning, Tuskens have been portrayed as violent and dangerous, never given sympathy, and dehumanized to the point of being called animals. Even the liberal icon of Padme sees genocide of them as something humans do. As pretty obvious stand-ins for indigenous people groups, the original 6 films made it rather clear. While directly killing them may be wrong, the Sand People do not have claim to this land just because they lived on it before the settlers came, and they are seen as below human. This would be bad enough, but for once, things were looking up, comparatively. The Mandalorian and the first 2 episodes of Boba Fett made a drastic turnaround. The Tuskens were portrayed as the rightful inhabitants of Tatooine, people that should, in a just world, be allowed to live in the Dune Sea without harassment from outsiders. We saw so much more culture, humanity, and respect given to them than ever before. They weren't made out to be perfect, but deserving of sovereignty, and fans took notice. I saw dozens of indigenous Star Wars fans on social media websites express reserved happiness about this portrayal. While they rightfully wanted indigenous writers and directors, I read plenty of people appreciate showing the Tuskens as no longer animals or monsters, but people, and people with emotions, culture, aspirations, and diversity. Of course, no indigenous group is a monolith, so there were those that didn't care for it, considering it did include Boba, an outsider, needing to teach them, and that's a valid concern, although those calling Boba a white savior really don't know what white means. Other very valid concerns included the fact that the Tuskens weren't given their own voice without a translator. Anyways, though not every person I saw was excited, so many saw this as a positive trend and were cautiously optimistic. The thing is, the precise reason that optimism was cautious came through. Episode 3 shows the Tuskens massacred, not on screen, but their bodies lifeless and their village destroyed. This is unquestionably a depiction of genocide of an indigenous people group, written and directed by people that are not indigenous. Tamura Morrison is indigenous, but none of the story writers behind this scene were, and they are marketing and profiting off of the very real pain and sorrow felt by indigenous people groups around the world. All of the optimism I saw one week was replaced with anger and disappointment the next. Again, a disclaimer, as no indigenous group is a monolith, there are some that like this storytelling beat, but the acceptance of some doesn't erase the harm done to others. When you have historically dehumanized your franchise's stand-in for indigenous people, but finally start to show them as actual characters beyond just xenophobic colonialist tropes, only to default on the trope of the tragic genocide so you can make one of your characters mad at one of your bad guys, you've traded in the goodwill you bought earlier for suffering. Hello everybody, thank you very much for watching and listening. If you enjoyed the editing on this video, I highly recommend you check out the channel, The First Okiro. Okiro is a friend of mine and did the editing on this video, and as you can see, it's fantastic. And if you like video essays in general, or if you're just looking for a good YouTube channel to watch, I could not recommend that one enough. Thank you everybody, and have a great rest of the day.